Chapter 29. Thoughts and Interpretations. I lately heard the story of a pious Negro woman whose faith in hell was sorely tried by a skeptic who asked her how brimstone enough could be found to burn all the wicked people in the world. After taking some days for reflection, the old woman, when next challenged by the skeptic, replied that she had concluded that every man took his own brimstone. This humble saint was unconscious that her instinct had reached the finest thought of Milton, whose Satan says, "Myself am hell." Marlowe's Mephistopheles also says, "Where we are is hell." And far back as the year 633, the holy man Fursey, who believed himself to have been guided by an angel near the region of the damned, related a vision much like the view of the African woman. There were 4 fires: falsehood, covetousness, discord, injustice, which joined to form one great flame. When this drew near, Fursey, in fear, said, "Lord, behold, the fire draws near me." The angel answered, "That which you did not kindle shall not burn you." Such association of any principle of justice, even in form so crude, has become rare enough in Christendom to excite applause when it appears, though the applause has about it that infusion of the grotesque which one perceives when gallery gods cheer the actor who heroically declares that a man ought not to strike a woman. When we go back to the atmosphere of paganism, we find that retribution had among them a real meaning. Nothing can be in more remarkable contrast than the disorderly, characterless hell of Christendom, into which the murderer and the man who confuses the persons of the Godhead alike burn everlastingly in most inappropriate fires, and the Hades of Egypt, Greece, and Rome, where every punishment bears relation to the offense and is limited in duration to the degree of the offense. The Egyptians, says Herodotus, Roman 2, 123, were the first who asserted that the soul of man is immortal, and that when the body perishes it enters into some other animal, constantly springing into existence, and when it has passed through the different kinds of terrestrial, marine, and aerial beings, it again enters into the body of a man that is born, and that this revolution is made in 3,000 years. Probably Plato imported from Egypt his fancy of the return of one dead to relate the scenes of heaven and hell, the Armenian Republic, X. 614, suggesting an evolution of Rhampsinitus Herod, Roman 2, 122, who descended to Hades alive, played dice with Ceres, and brought back gold. The vision of represents a terrible hell indeed, but those punished were chiefly murderers and tyrants. They are punished tenfold for every wrong they had committed. But when this punishment is ended, each soul must return to the earth in such animal form as he or she might select. The animals, too, had their choice. Saw that the choice was generally determined by the previous earthly life, many becoming animals because of some spite derived from their experience. And not only did men pass into animals, but I must also mention that there were animals tame and wild who changed into one another, and into corresponding human natures, the good into the gentle, the evil into the savage, in all sorts of combinations. Sly Plato, such is his estimate of what men's selections of their paradises are worth. Orpheus chose to be a swan, hating to be born of woman, because women murdered him. Ajax became a lion and Agamemnon an eagle, because they had suffered injustice from men. Atalanta would be an athlete, and the jester the recites a monkey, and Odysseus went about to find the life of a private gentleman with nothing to do. If Plutarch's friend Thespesius had pondered well this irony of Plato, he would hardly have brought back from his visit to Hades the modification that demons were provided to assign the animal forms in which souls should be born again on earth. They could hardly have done for the wicked anything worse than Plato shows them doing for themselves. But the meaning of Plutarch is the same. Thespesius sees demons preparing the body of a viper for Nero to be born into, since it was said the young of that reptile destroy their mother at birth. Among the Persians, the idea of future rewards and punishments exceeds the exactness of the Quran. Whoso hath done an atom of justice shall behold it, and whoso hath done an atom of injustice shall behold it. The Persian Sufis will even subdivide the soul rather than that any good act should go down with the larger gross of wickedness. Sadi tells of a vision where a man was seen in hell, all except one foot, which was twined with flowers. With all his wickedness, the man had with that foot shoved a bundle of hay within reach of a weary ox. But while Persian poet Sufis, ennobling the old name, sophist preserved thus a good deal of the universalism of Parsaism, A Mohammedanism hard as the Scythians who brought it, turned the heart of the people in that country to stone. In the Dresden Library, there is an illuminated Persian Miz, thought to be 700 years old, which has in it what may be regarded as a portrait of Ahriman and Iblis combined. He is red, has a heavy beard and mustache, and there is a long dragon's crest and mane on his head. He wears a green and blue skirt about his loins. His tongue rolls thirstily between his cruel teeth. He superintends a number of fish-like devils which float in a lake of fire and swallow the damned. Above this scene are the glorified souls, including the Shah sitting cross-legged on his rug, who look down on the tortures beneath with evident satisfaction. Apparently this is the only amusement which relieves the ennui of their heaven. If anything could make a rational man believe in a fiend principle in the universe, it would be the suggestion of such pictures, that men have existed who could conceive of happiness enjoyed in view of such tortures as these. This and some similar pictures in the East, for instance, that in the Temple of Horrors at Wuchang, China are absolutely rayless so far as any touch of humanity is concerned. Are the Shah and his happy fellow inspectors of tortures really fiends? In the light of our present intelligence, they may seem so. Certainly no person of refined feeling could now expect to attain any heaven while others were in hell. But it would be possible if persons could believe that many of those around them are not men and women at all, but fiends in human shape. These ferocious hells are referable to a period when all who incurred the sentences of princes or priests were seen as mere masks of devils. They were only ascribed human flesh that they may suffer. The dogma of hell was doomed from the moment that the damned were supposed to be really human. Were those who killed the martyrs of heresy, for instance, to return to the world and look upon those whom they pierced, they could never recognize them. Were they to see the statues of Bruno, Huss, Cranmer, Servetus, the names and forms would not recall to them the persons they slew. They would be shocked if told that they had burned great men, and would surely answer, "Men? We burned no men." The devil came among us calling himself Huss, and we made short work with him. He reappeared under several aliases: Bruno, Servetus, Spinoza, Voltaire. Sometimes we burned him, at other times managed to make him miserable, thank God. But we were not hurting real men, we were saving them. Around such ideas grew our yet uncivilized codes of law. In England, anno 1878, men are refused as jurymen if they will not say, "So help me God," on the ground that an atheist cannot have a conscience. Only let him really be without conscience and call himself a Christian when he is not, and courts receive the selfish liar with respect. The old clause of the death sentence instigated thereto by the devil has been dropped in the case of murderers, however, and that is some gain. Torture by fire of the worst murderer for one day would not be permitted in Christendom. Belief in hellfire outlasts it for a little among the ignorant, but what shall be said of the educated who profess to believe it? The Venerable Bede relates that, in the year 696, a Northumbrian gentleman, who had died in the beginning of the night, came to life and health in the morning, and gave an account of what he had seen overnight. He had witnessed the conventional tortures of the damned, but adds being thus on all sides enclosed with enemies and darkness, and looking about on every side for assistance, there appeared to me, on the way that I came, as it were, the brightness of a star shining amidst the darkness, which increased by degrees, but we need not go on to the anticlimax of this vision. This star rising above all such visions belongs to the vault of the human love, and it is visible through all the ages of darkness. It cannot be quenched, and its fiery rays have burnt up mountains of iniquity. In the year 1322, writes Flogel, after the Chroniken Sampatrinum Erfertense, there was a play shown at Eisenach which had a tragical enough effect. Markgraf Friedrich of Misnia, Landgraf also of Thuringia, having brought his tedious warfare to a conclusion, and the country beginning now to revive under peace, his subjects were busy repaying themselves for the past distresses by all manner of diversions, to which end, apparently by the sovereign's order, a dramatic representation of the 10 virgins was schemed, and ad Eisenach, in his presence, duly executed. This happened 15 days after Easter, by indulgence of the preaching friars. In the Chroniken Sampatrinum, stands recorded that the play was enacted in the Bear Garden in Horto Ferrarum by the clergy and their scholars. But now, when it came to pass that the wise virgins would give the foolish no oil, and these latter were shut out from the bridegroom, they began to weep bitterly, and called on the saints to intercede for them, who, however, even with Mary at their head, could effect nothing from God. But the foolish virgins were all sentenced to damnation. Which things the Landgraf seeing and hearing, he fell into a doubt and was very angry, and said, "What then is the Christian faith, if God will not take pity on us for intercession of Mary and all the saints?" In this anger he continued 5 days, and the learned men could hardly enlighten him to understand the gospel. Thereupon he was struck with apoplexy, and became speechless and powerless, in which sad state he continued, bedrid, 2 years and 7 months, and so died, being then 55. In telling the story, Carlyle remarks that these 10 virgins at Eisenach are more fatal to warlike men than Aeschylus' Furies at Athens were to weak women. Even so, until great-hearted men rose up at Eisenach and elsewhere to begin the work destined to prove fatal alike to heartless virgins and Furies. That star of a warrior's compassion, hovering over the foolish friars and their midnight gospel, beams far. The story reminds me of an incident related of a mining district in California where a rude theater was erected, and a company gave, as their first performance, Othello. When the scene of Desdemona's suffocation approached, a stalwart miner leaped on the stage and, pulling out his 6-shooter, said to the Moor, "You damned nigger. If you touch that woman, I'll blow the top of your head off." A dozen roughs, clambering over the footlights, cried, "Right, Joe, we'll stand by you." The manager met the emergency by crying, "Don't shoot, boys. This play was wrote by Bill Shakespeare. He's an old Californian, and it's all in fun." Had this Moor proceeded to roast Desdemona in fire with any verisimilitude, it is doubtful if the manager could have saved him by an argument reminding the miners that such was the divine way with sinners in the region to which most of them were going. The top of that theologic hell's head is not very safe in these days when human nature is unchained with all its 6-shooters, each liable to be touched off by fire from that star revolving in the sphere of compassion. Day after day I gazed upon Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel. The artist was in his 60th year when Pope Clement Roman VII invited him to cover a wall 60 feet high and nearly as wide with a picture of the Day of Wrath. In 7 years he had finished it. Clement was dead. Pope Paul Roman IV looked at it and liked it not. All he could see was a vast number of naked figures, so he said it was not fit for the Sistine Chapel and must be destroyed. One of Michelangelo's pupils saved it by draping some of the figures. Time went on, and another pope came who insisted on more drapery, so the work was disfigured again. However, popular ridicule saved this from going very far, and so there remains the tremendous scene. But popes and cardinals always disliked it. The first impression I received from it was that of a complete representation of all the physical powers belonging to organized life. Though the forms are human, every animal power is there, leaping, crouching, crawling, every sinew, joint, muscle, portrayed in completest tension and action. Then the eye wanders from face to face, and every passion that ever crawled or prowled in jungle or swamp is pictured. The most unpleasant expressions seemed to me those of the martyrs. They came up from their graves, each bringing the instrument by which he had suffered, and offering it in witness against the poor wretches who came to be judged. And there was a look of self-righteous satisfaction on their faces as they witnessed the persecution of their persecutors. As for Christ, he was like a fury, with hand uplifted against the doomed, his hair wildly floating. The tortured people below are not in contrast with the blessed above. They who are in heaven look rather more stupid than the others, and rather pleased with the anguish they witness, but not more saintly. But gradually, the eye, having wandered over the vast canvas, from the tortured cardinal at the bottom up to the furious judge, alights on a face which, once seen, is never to be forgotten. Beautiful she is, that Mary beside the judge, and more beautiful for the pain that is on her face. She has drawn her drapery to veil from her sight the anguish below. She has turned her face from the judge, does not see her son in him. She looks not upon the blessed, for she, the gentle mother, is not in heaven. She cannot have joy in sight of misery. In that one face of pure womanly sympathy, that beauty transfigured in its compassionateness, the artist put his soul, his religion. Mary's face quenches all the painted flames. They are at once made impossible. The same universe could not produce both a hell and that horror of it. The furious Jesus is changed to a phantasm. He could never be born of such a mother. If the popes had only wished to hide the nakedness of their own dogmas, they ought to have blotted out Mary's face. For as it now stands, the rest of the forms are but shapes to show how all the wild forms and passions of human animalism gather as a frame round that which is their consummate flower. the spirit of love enshrined in its perfect human expression. So was it that Michelangelo could not serve two masters. Popes might employ him, but he could not do the work they liked. The passive master lent his hand to the vast soul that o'er him planned. He could not help it. The lover of beauty could not paint the day of wrath without setting above it that face like a star which shines through its unreality, burns up its ugliness, and leaves the picture a magnificent interpretation of the forms of nature and hopes of the world. A cardinal hypocrite at the bottom, an ideal woman at the top. Exhausted by the too much glory of the visions of paradise which he had seen, Dante came forth to the threshold opening on the world of human life, from which he had parted for a space, and there sank down. As he lay, their angels caused lilies to grow beneath and around him, and myrtle to rise and intertwine for a bower over him, and their happy voices, wafted in low-toned hymns, brought soft sleep to his overwrought senses. Long had he slumbered before the light of familiar day stole once more into those deep eyes. The angels had departed. The poet awoke to find himself alone, and with a sigh he said to himself, "It is, then, all but a dream." As he arose, he saw before him a man of noble mien and shining countenance, habited in an Eastern robe, who returned his gaze with an interest equal to his own. Quickly the eyes of Dante searched the ground beside the stranger to see if he were shadowless. Convinced thus that he was true flesh and blood, the Florentine thus addressed him. "Pilgrim, for such thou seemest, may we meet in simple human brotherhood. If, as thy garb suggests, thou comest from afar, perchance the friendly greeting, even of one who in his native city is still himself a pilgrim, may not be unwelcome. Heart to heart be our kiss, my brother, yet must I journey without delay to those who watch and wait for wondrous tidings that I bear. Friend, I hear some meaning deeper than thy words. If 'twere but as satisfying natural curiosity, answer not, but if thou bearest a burden of tidings glad for all humankind, speak. Who art thou, whence comest, and with what message freighted? Artavaraf is the name I bear. From Persia have I come. But by what strange paths have reached this spot know I not, save that through splendors of worlds invisible to mortal sense I have journeyed, nor encountered human form, till I found thee slumbering on this spot. Trebly then art thou my brother. I too have but now, as to my confused sense it seems, emerged from that vast journey. Thou clearest from me gathering doubts that those visions were elusive. Yet, as even things we really see are often overlaid by images that lurk in the eye, I pray thee tell me something thou hast seen, so that perchance we may part with mutual confirmation of our vision. That gladly will I do. When the Avesta had been destroyed, and the sages of Iran disagreed as to the true religion, they agreed that one should be chosen by lot to drink the sacred draught of Vishtasp, that he might pass to the invisible world and bring intelligence therefrom. On me the lot fell. Beside the fire that has never gone out, surrounded by holy women who chanted our hymns, I drank the 3 cups well thought, well said, well done. Then as I slept there rose before me a high stairway of 3 steps. On the first was written well thought, on the second well said, on the third well done. By the first step I reached the realm where good thoughts are honored. There were the thinkers whose star-like radiance ever increased. They offered no prayers, they chanted no liturgies. Above all was the sphere of the liberal. The next step brought me to the circle of great and truthful speakers. These walked in lofty splendor. The third step brought me to the heaven of good actions. I saw the souls of agriculturists surrounded by spirits of water and earth, trees and cattle. The artisans were seated on embellished thrones. Sublime were the seats of teachers, interceders, peacemakers, and the religious walked in light and joy with which none are satiated. Saw'st thou the fairest of earth-born ladies, Beatrice? I saw indeed a lady most fair. In a pleasant grove lay the form of a man who had but then parted from earth. When he had awakened, he walked through the grove, and there met him this most beautiful maiden. To her he said, "Who art thou, so fair beyond all whom I have seen in the land of the living?" To him she replied, "O youth, I am thy actions. Can this be thy lady Beatrice? But saw'st thou no hell, no dire punishments? Alas, sad scenes I witnessed, sufferers whose hell was that their darkness was amid the abodes of splendor. Amid all that glow, one newly risen from earth walked shivering with cold, and there walked ever by his side a hideous hag. On her he turned and said, "Who art thou that ever movest beside me, thou that art monstrous beyond all that I have seen on earth?" To him she replied, "Man, I am thy actions. But who were those glorious ones thou saw'st in paradise?" Some of their names I did indeed learn: Zoroaster, Socrates, Plato, Buddha, Confucius, Christ. What do I hear? Knowest thou that none of these save that last Holy One whom methinks thou namest too lightly among men are baptized? Those have these eyes sorrowfully beheld in pain through the mysterious justice of God. Thinkest thou, then, thy own compassion deeper than the mercy of Ormuzd? But now indeed I do remember. As I conversed with the sages I had named, they related to me this strange event. By guidance of one of their number, Virgil by name, there had come among them from the earth a most powerful magician. He bore the name of Dante. By mighty spells this being had cast them all into a sad circle which he called limbo, over whose gate he wrote, though with eyes full of tears, "All hope abandon, ye who enter here." Thus were they in great sorrow and dismay. But presently, as this strange Dante was about to pass on, so they related, he looked upon the face of one among them so pure and noble that though he had styled him pagan, he could not bear to abandon him there. This was Cato of Utica. Him this Dante led to the door, and gave him liberty on condition that he would be warder of his unbaptized brethren, and by no means let any of them escape. No sooner, however, was this done than this magician beheld others who moved his reverence, among them Trajan and Ripheus, and overcome by an impulse of love, he opened a window in the side of limbo, bidding them emerge into light. He then waved his Christian wand to close up this aperture, and passed away, supposing that he had done so. But the limit of that magician's power had been reached, the window was but veiled, and after he had gone all these unbaptized ones passed out by that way, and reascended to the glory they had enjoyed before this Dante had brought his alien sorceries to bear upon them for a brief space. Can this be true? Is it indeed so that all the sages and poets of the world are now in equal rank, whether or not they have been sealed as members of Christ? Brother, thy brow is overcast. What? Can one so pure and high of nature as thou desire that the gentle Christ, whom I saw embracing the sages and prophets of other ages, should turn upon them with hatred and bind them in gloom and pain like this Dante? Thereupon, with a flood of tears, Dante fell at the feet of Artaviraf and kissed the hem of his skirt. "Purer is thy vision, O pilgrim, than mine," he said. "I fear that I have but borne with me to the invisible world the small prejudices of my little church, which hath taught me to limit the love which I now see to be boundless. Thou who hast learned from thy Zoroaster that the meaning of God is the end of all evil, a universe climbing to its flower in joy, deign to take the hand of thy servant, and make him worthy to be thy friend with thee henceforth, to abandon the poor formulas which ignorance substitutes for virtue, and ascend to the beautiful summits thou hast visited by the stairway of good thoughts, good words, good deeds." In 1745, Swedenborg was a student of natural philosophy in London. In the April of that year, his revelations began amid the smoke and toil of the great metropolis. I was hungry and ate with great appetite. Towards the end of the meal I remarked a kind of mist spread before my eyes, and I saw the floor of my room covered with hideous reptiles, such as serpents, toads, and the like. I was astonished, having all my wits about me, being perfectly conscious. The darkness attained its height and then passed away. I now saw a man sitting in the corner of the chamber. As I had thought myself alone, I was greatly frightened when he said to me, "Eat not as much." In Swedenborg's diary, the incident is related more particularly. "In the middle of the day, at dinner, an angel spoke to me and told me not to eat too much at table. Whilst he was with me, there plainly appeared to me a kind of vapor steaming from the pores of my body. It was a most visible watery vapor, and fell downwards to the ground upon the carpet, where it collected and turned into divers vermin, which were gathered together under the table, and in a moment went off with a pop or noise. A fiery light appeared within them, and a sound was heard, pronouncing that all the vermin that could possibly be generated by unseemly appetite were thus cast out of my body, and burnt up, and that I was now cleansed from them. Hence we may know what luxury and the like have for their bosom contents." Continuing the first account, Swedenborg said, "The following night the same man appeared to me again. I was this time not at all alarmed. The man said, 'I am God, the Lord, the Creator and Redeemer of the world. I have chosen thee to unfold to men the spiritual sense of the Holy Scripture. I will myself dictate to thee what thou shalt write.' The same night the world of spirits, hell and heaven, were convincingly open to me, where I found many persons of my acquaintance of all conditions. From that day forth I gave up all worldly learning, and labored only in spiritual things, according to what the Lord commanded me to write. He gave up all worldly learning, shut his intellectual eyes, and sank under all the nightmares which his first vision saw burnt up as vermin. After his 50th year, says Emerson, he falls into jealousy of his intellect, makes war on it, and the violence is instantly avenged. But the portrait of the blinded mystic as drawn by the clear seer is too impressive an illustration to be omitted here. A vampire sits in the seat of the prophet and turns with gloomy appetite to the images of pain. Indeed, a bird does not more readily weave its nest or a mole bore in the ground than this seer of the souls substructs a new hell and pit, each more abominable than the last, round every new crew of offenders. He was let down through a column that seemed of brass, but it was formed of angelic spirits, that he might descend safely amongst the unhappy and witness the vastation of souls, and heard there for a long continuance their lamentations. He saw their tormentors, who increase and strain pangs to infinity. He saw the hell of the jugglers, the hell of the assassins, the hell of the lascivious, the hell of robbers, who kill and boil men, the infernal ton of the deceitful, the excrementitious hells. The hell of the revengeful, whose faces resembled a round, broad cake and their arms rotate like a wheel. The universe, in his poem, suffers under a magnetic sleep and only reflects the mind of the magnetizer. Swedenborg and Bayman both failed by attaching themselves to the Christian symbol instead of to the moral sentiment, which carries innumerable Christianities, humanities, divinities in its bosom. Another dogma, growing out of this pernicious theologic limitation, is this inferno. Swedenborg has devils. Evil, according to old philosophers, is good in the making. That pure malignity can exist is the extreme proposition of unbelief. To what a painful perversion had Gothic theology arrived, that Swedenborg admitted no conversion for evil spirits. But the divine effort is never relaxed. The carrion in the sun will convert itself to grass and flowers, and man, though in brothels or jails or on gibbets, is on his way to all that is good and true. But even the hell of Swedenborg is not free from the soft potency of our star. It is almost painful, indeed, to see its spiritual ray mingling with the fiery fever shapes which Swedenborg meets on his way through the column of brass made, had he known it, not of angels but of savage scriptures. I gave up all worldly learning, he says, but it did not give him up all at once. They, the damned, suffer ineffable torments, but it was permitted to relieve or console them with a certain degree of hope, so that they should not entirely despair. For they said they believed the torment would be eternal. They were relieved or consoled by saying that God Messiah is merciful, and that in his word we read that the prisoners will be sent forth from the pit. Zech, Roman 9, 2. Swedenborg reports that God Messiah appeared to these spirits, and even embraced and kissed one who had been raised from the greatest torment. He says, punishment for the sake of punishment is the punishment of a devil, and affirms that all punishment is to take away evils or to induce a faculty of doing good. These utterances are in his diary, and were written before he had got to the bottom of his Calvinistic column. But even in the Arcana Celestia, there is a gleam. Such is the equilibrium of all things in another life that evil punishes itself. And unless it were removed by punishments, the evil spirits must necessarily be kept in some hell to eternity. Reductio ad absurdum. And yet Swedenborgians insist upon the dogma of everlasting punishments, to sustain which they appeal from Swedenborg half-sober to Swedenborg mentally drunk. In the library at Dresden, there is a series of old pictures said to be Mexican, and which I was told had been purchased from a Jew in Vienna, containing devils mainly of serpent characters blended with those of humanity. One was a fantastic serpent with human head, sharp snoutish nose, many eyes, slight wings, and tongue lolling out. Another had a human head and reptilian tail. A third is human, except for the double tongue darting out. A fourth has issuing from the back of his head a serpent whose large dragon head is swallowing a human embryo. Whatever tribe it was that originated these pictures must have had very strong impressions of the survival of the serpent in some men. I was reminded of the picture of the serpent swallowing the human embryo while looking at the wall pictures in Russian churches representing the conventional serpent with devils nestling at intervals along its body, as represented in our figure 10. Professor Busleaf gave me the right archaeology of this, no doubt, but the devils themselves, as I gazed, seemed to intimate another theory with their fair forms. They might have been winged angels, but for their hair of flame and cruel hooks. They seemed to say, "We were the ancient embryo gods of the human imagination, but the serpent swallowed us. He swallowed us successively, as one after another we availed ourselves of his cunning in our priesthoods, as we brought his cruel coils to crush those who dared to outgrow our cult, as we imitated his fang in the deadliness with which we bit the heel of every advancing thinker as, when worsted in our struggle against reason, we took to the double tongue, praising with one fork the virtues which we poisoned with the other. Now we are degraded with him forever, bound to him by these rings, labeled with the sins we have committed." It was by a true experience that the ancients so generally took nocturnal animals to be types of diabolism. Corresponding to them are the sleepless activities of morally unawakened men. The animal is a sleeping man. Its passions and instincts are acted out in what to rational man would be dreams. In dreams, especially when influenced by disease, a man may mentally relapse very far and pass through kennels and sties, which are such even when somewhat decorated by shreds of the familiar human environment. The nocturnal form of intellect is cunning. The obscuration of religion is superstition. The dark shadow that falls on love turns it to lust. These wolves and bats, on which no ideal has dawned, do not prowl or flit through man in their natural forms. In the half-awake consciousness, whose starlight attends man amid his darkness, their misty outlines swell, and in the feverish, unenlightened conscience, they become phantasms of his animalism, werewolves, vampires. The awakening of reason in any animal is through all the phases of cerebral and social evolution. A wise man said to his son who was afraid to enter the dark, "Go on, child, you will never see anything worse than yourself." The hair lip, which we sometimes see in the human face, is there an arrested development. Every lip is at some embryonic period a hair lip. The development of man's visible part has gone on much longer than his intellectual and moral evolution, and abnormalities in it are rare in comparison with the number of survivals from the animal world in his temper, his faith, and his manners. Criminals are men living out their arrested moral developments. They who regard them as instigated by a devil are those whose arrest is mental. The eye of reason will deal with both all the more effectively, because with as little wrath as a surgeon feels towards the hair lip he endeavors to humanize. It is an impressive fact that the great and reverent mind of Spinoza, in pondering the problem of evil and the theology which ascribed it to a devil, was unconsciously led to anticipate by more than a century the first modern scientific suggestions of the principle of evolution. In his early treatise, De Dio et Homine, occurs this short but momentous chapter. De Diabolis, if the devil be an entity contrary in all respects to God, having nothing of God in his nature, there can be nothing in common with God. Is he assumed to be a thinking entity, as some will have it, who never wills and never does any good, and who sets himself in opposition to God on all occasions, he would assuredly be a very wretched being. And, could prayers do anything for him, his amendment were much to be implored. But let us ask whether so miserable an object could exist even for an instant, and, the question put, we see at once that it could not. For from the perfection of a thing proceeds its power of continuance. The more of the essential and divine a thing possesses, the more enduring it is. But how could the devil, having no trace of perfection in him, exist at all? Add to this that the stability or duration of a thinking thing depends entirely on its love of and union with God, and that the opposite of this state in every particular being presumed in the devil, it is obviously impossible that there can be any such being. And then there is indeed no necessity to presume the existence of a devil, for the causes of hate, envy, anger, and all such passions are readily enough to be discovered, and there is no occasion for resort to fiction to account for the evils they engender. In the course of his correspondence with the most learned men of his time, Spinoza was severely questioned concerning his views upon human wickedness, the disobedience of Adam, and so forth. He said to abridge his answers, if there be any essential or positive evil in men, God is the author and continuer of that evil. But what is called evil in them is their degree of imperfection as compared with those more perfect. Adam, in the abstract, is a man eating an apple. That is not in itself an evil action. Acts condemned in man are often admired in animals as the jealousy of doves and regarded as evidence of their perfection. Although man must restrain the forces of nature and direct them to his purposes, it is a superstition to suppose that God is angry against such forces. It is an error in man to identify his little inconveniences as obstacles to God. Let him withdraw himself from the consideration, and nothing is found evil. Whatever exists by reason of its perfection for its own ends, which may or may not be those of men. Spinoza's aphorism, "From the perfection of a thing proceeds its power of continuance," is the earliest modern statement of the doctrine now called survival of the fittest. The notion of a devil involves the solipsism of a being surviving through its unfitness for survival. Spinoza was Copernicus of the moral cosmos, the great German who discovered to men that their little planet was not the one center and single care of nature, led the human mind out of a closet and gave it a universe. But dogma still clung to the closet, where indeed each sect still remains, holding its little interest to be the aim of the solar system, and all outside it to be part of a countless host, marshaled by a prince of evil, whose eternal war is waged against that formidable pulpiteer whose sermon is sending dismay through pandemonium. But for rational men, all that is ended, and its decline began when Spinoza warned men against looking at the moral universe from the pinhole of their egotism. That closet creation, whose laws were seen now acting, now suspended to suit the affairs of men, disappeared, and man was led to adore the all. It is a small thing that man can bruise the serpent's head, if its fang still carries its venom so deep in his reason as to blacken all nature with a sense of triumphant malevolence. To the eye of judicial man, instructed to decide every case without bribe of his own interest as a rival animal, the serpent's fang is one of the most perfect adaptations of means to ends in nature. Were a corresponding perfection in every human mind, the world would fulfill the mystical dream of the East, which gave one name to the serpents that bit them in the wilderness and seraphim singing round the eternal throne. Cursed be the Hebrew who shall either eat pork or permit his son to be instructed in the learning of the Greeks. So says the Talmud, with a voice transmitted from the kingdom of priests, Exod, Roman 19:6. From the altar of unhewn stone came the curse upon art, and upon the race that represented culture raising its tool upon the rudeness of nature. That curse of the Talmud recoiled fearfully. The Jewish priesthood had their son in Peter with his vision of clean and unclean animals, and the command, slay and eat. Uninstructed is this heir of priestly Judaism in the learning of the Greeks. Consequently, his way of converting Gentiles the herd of swine, the goyim is to convert them into Christian protoplasm. Slay and eat became the cry of the elect, and their first victim was the paternal Jew who taught them that pork and Greek learning belonged to the same category. But there was another Jewish nation not composed of priests. While the priestly kingdom is typified in Jonah announcing the destruction of Nineveh, who, because the great city still goes on, reproaches Jehovah, the nation of the poets has now its Jehovah Roman too. Who sees the humiliation of the tribal priesthood as a withered gourd compared with the arts, wealth, and human interests of a Gentile city. The Lord repented. The first gospel to the Gentiles is in that gentle thought for the uncircumcised Ninevites, but it was reached too late. When it gained expression in Christ welcoming Greeks and seeing in stones possible children of Abraham, in Paul acknowledging debt to barbarians and taking his texts from Greek altars or poets, the evolution of the ideal element in Hebrew religion had gained much. But historic combinations raised the Judaizers to a throne, and all the narrowness of their priesthood was reenacted as Christianity. The column of brass in whose hollow center the fine brain of Swedenborg was imprisoned is a fit similitude of the Christian formula. The whole moral attitude of Christianity towards nature is represented in his first vision. The beginning of his spiritual career is announced by the evaporation of his animal nature in the form of vermin. The Christian hell is present, and these animal parts are burnt up. Among those burnt-up powers of Swedenborg, one of the serpents must have been his intellect. From that day forth I gave up all worldly learning. Here we have the ideal Christian caught up to his paradise, even while his outward shape is visible. But what if we were all to become like that? Suppose all the animal powers and desires were to evaporate out of mankind, and to be burnt up. Were that to occur today, the effect on the morrow would be but faintly told in that which would be caused by sudden evaporations of steam from all the engines of the world. We may imagine a band of philanthropists, sorely disturbed by the number of accidents incidental to steam locomotion, who should conspire to go at daybreak to all the engine houses and stations in England, and, just as the engines were about to start for their work, should quench their fires, let off their steam, and break their works. That would be but a brief paralysis of the work of one country. But what would be the result if the animal nature of man and its desires, the works and trades that minister to the pomps and vanities, all worldly aims and joys, should be burnt up in fires of fanaticism? Yet to that fatal aim Christianity gave itself so contrary to that great heart in which was mirrored the beautiful world, its lilies and little children, and where love shed its beams on the just and the unjust. The organizing principle of Christianity was that which crucified Jesus and took his tomb for cornerstone of a system modeled after what he hated. Its central purpose was to effect a divorce between the moral and the animal nature of man. One is called flesh and the other spirit. One was the child of God, the other the child of the devil. It rent asunder that which was really one. Its whole history, so long as it was in earnest, was the fanatical effort to keep asunder by violence those two halves ever seeking harmony. Its history since its falsity was exposed has been the hypocrisy of professing in word what is impossible in deed. Beside the Christian vision of Swedenborg, in which the Judaic priest's curse on swinish Greek learning found apotheosis, let us set the vision of a Jewish seer in whom the humanity that spared Nineveh found expression. The seer is Philo, name rightly belonging to that pure mind in which the starry ideals of his Semitic race embraced the sensuous beauty which alone could give them life. Philo, Prime. Et Ponies, Sec 1520, describes as the first joy of the redeemed earth the termination of the war between man and animal. That war will end, he says, when the wild beasts in the soul have been tamed. Then the most ferocious animals will submit to man, scorpions will lose their stings, and serpents their poison. And, in consequence of the suppression of that older war between man and beast, the war between man and man shall also end. Here we emerge from Swedenborg's brass column, we pass beyond Peter's sword called slay and eat. We leave behind the Talmud's curse on swine and learning. We rise to the clear vision of Hebrew prophecy which beheld lion and lamb lying down together. A child leading the wild forces subdued by culture. Why not God kill devil? Asked Man Friday. It is a question which not even psychology has answered, why no theology has yet suggested the death of the devil in the past, or prophesied more than chains for him in the future. No doubt the need of a hangman's whip to haud the wretch in order may partly account for it, but with this may have combined a cause of which it is pleasanter to think devils being animal passions in excess. Even the ascetic recoils from their destruction, with an instinct like that which restrains rats from gnawing holes through the ship's bottom. In Goethe's Faust, we read, Doc des Antiqui find, ich zu lebendig. It is a criticism on the nudity of the Greek forms that appear in the classical Walpurgis Night, but the authority is not good. It is Mephistopheles who is disgusted with sight of the human form, and he says they ought in modern fashion to be plastered over. His sentiments have prevailed at the Vatican, where the antique statues and the great pictures of Michelangelo bear witness to the prurient prudery of the papal mind. Devils are our sins in perspective, says George Herbert. Herodotus, Roman 2:47 says, the Egyptians consider the pig to be an impure beast, and therefore if a man, in passing by a pig, should touch him only with his garments, he forthwith goes to the river and plunges in. And in the next place, swineherds, although native Egyptians, are the only men who are not allowed to enter any of their temples. The Egyptians, he says, do not sacrifice the goat. And, indeed, their painters and sculptors represent Pan with the face and legs of a goat, as the Grecians do, not that they imagine this to be his real form, for they think him like other gods, but why they represent him in this way I had rather not mention. We need not feel the same prudery. The Egyptians rightly regarded the symbol of sexual desire, on whose healthy exercise the perpetuation of life depended, as a very different kind of animalism from that symbolized in the pig's love of refuse and garbage. Their association of the goat with Pan, the lusty vigor of nature, was the natural preface to the arts of Greece, in which the wild forces were taught their first lesson: temperance. Pan becomes musical. The vigor and vitality of human nature find in the full but not excessive proportions of Apollo, Aphrodite, Artemis, and others of the bright array, the harmony which Pan with his pipe preludes. The Greek statue is soul-embodied and body-ensouled. Two men had I the happiness to know in my youth, into whose faces I looked up and saw the throne of genius illumined by purity. One of them, Ralph Waldo Emerson, wrote, "If beauty, softness, and faith in female forms have their own influence, vices even in a slight degree are thought to improve the expression." The other, Arthur Hugh Clough, wrote, "What we all love is good touched up with evil." Here are two brave flowers, of which one grew out of the thorny stem of Puritanism, the other from the monastic root of Oxford. The vices, which could improve the expression, even for the pure eyes of Emerson, are those which represent the struggle of human nature to exist in truth, albeit in misdirection and reaction, amid pious hypocrisies. The Oxonian scholar had seen enough of the conventionalized characterless good to long for some sign of life and freedom, even though it must come as a touch of evil. To the artist, nature is never seen in petrifaction. It is really as well as literally a becoming. The evil he sees is good in the making. What others call vices are voices in the wilderness preparing the way of the highest. God and the devil make the whole of religion, said Niccoli, speaking, perhaps, better than he knew. The culture of the world has shown that the sometime opposed realms of human interest, so personified, are equally essential. It is through this experience that the devil has gained such ample vindication from the poet says in Rapisardes, Lucifero, a veritable bringer of light, and Cranch's Satan. From the latter work, Satan, a libretto. Boston, Roberts Brothers, 1874, which should be more widely known, I quote some lines. Satan says, "I symbolize the wild and deep and unregenerated wastes of life, dark, with transmitted tendencies of race and blind mischance. All crude mistakes of will and tendency, unbalanced by due weight of favoring circumstance. All passion blown by wandering winds. All surplusage of force piled up for use, but slipping from its base of law and order." This is the very realm in which the poet and the artist find their pure-veined quarries, whence arise the forms transfigured in their vision. To evoke Helena, Faust, as we have seen, must repair to the mothers. But who may these be? They shine from Goethe's page in such opalescent tints one cannot transfix their sense. They seem to me just now the primal conditions, by fulfilling which anything might be attained, without which nothing. But now, yet perhaps the difference is not great, I see the mothers to be the ancient healthy instincts and ideals of our race. These took shape in forms of art, whose evolution had been man's harmony with himself. Christianity, borrowing thunder of one god, hammer of another, shattered our mothers. And now learned travelers go about in many lands saying, "Saw ye my beloved?" Amid cities ruined and buried, we are trying to recover them, fitting limb to limb so carefully, as if half-conscious that we are piecing together again the fragments of our own humanity. The devil, does he exist, and what does he do? Such is the title of a recent work by Father Delaporte, professor of dogma in the faculty of Bordeaux. He gives specific directions for exorcism of devils by means of holy water, the sign of the cross, and other charms. These measures, says one of his American critics, may answer very well against the French devil, but our American Beelzebub is a potentate that goeth not forth on any such hints. Father Delaporte would hardly contend that the use of cross and holy water for 1,000 years has been effectual in dislodging the European Beelzebub. On the whole, I am inclined to prefer the method of the Africans of the Guinea coast. They believe in a particularly hideous devil, but say that the only defense they require against him is a mirror. If anyone will keep a mirror beside him, the devil must see himself in it, and he at once rushes away in terror of his own ugliness. No monster ever conjured up by imagination is more hideous than a rational being transformed to a beast. Just that is every human being who has brought his nobler powers down to be slaves of his animal nature. No eye could look upon that fearful sight unmoved. All man needs is a true mirror in which his own animalism may see itself. We cannot borrow for this purpose the arts of Greece, nor the fairy ideals of Germany, nor the emasculated saints of Christendom. These were but fragments of the man who has been created by combination of their powers, and their several ideals are broken bits that cannot reflect the whole being of man in its proportions or disproportions. The higher nature of man, polished by culture of all his faculties, can alone be the faithful mirror before his lower. The clearness of this mirror in the individual heart depends mainly on the civilization and knowledge surrounding it. The discovered law turns once plausible theories to falsehoods. A noble literature transmutes once popular books to trash. When art interprets the realities of nature, when it shows how much beauty and purity our human nature is capable of, it holds a mirror before all deformities. At a theater in the city of London, I witnessed the performance of an actor who, in the course of his part, struck a child. He was complimented by a hurricane of hisses from the crowded gallery. Had those gods up there never struck children? Possibly. Yet here each had a mirror before him and recoiled from his worst self. A clergyman relates that, while looking at pictures in the Bethnal Green Museum, he overheard a poor woman, who had been gazing on a Madonna, say, "If I had such a child as that, I believe I could be a good woman." Who can say what even that one glance at her life in the ideal reflector may be worth to that wanderer amid the miseries and temptations of London? It is not easy for those who have seen what is high and holy to give their hearts to what is base and unholy. It is as natural for human nature to love virtue as to love any other beauty. External beauty is visible to all, and all desire it. The interior beauty is not visible to superficial glances, but the admiration shown even for its counterfeits shows how natural it is to admire virtue. But in order that the charm of this moral beauty may be felt by human nature, it must be related to that nature real. It must not be some childish ideal which answers to no need of the man of today, not something imported from a time and place where it had meaning and force to others where it has none. When dogmas surviving from the primitive world are brought to behold themselves in the mirror held up by science, they cry out, "That is not my face, you're caricaturing my beliefs." This recoil of superstition from its own ugliness is the victory of religion. What priests bewail as disbelief is faith fleeing from its deformities. Ignorant devotion proves its need of science by its terrors of the same, which are like those of the horse at first sight of its best friend, bearer of its burthens the locomotive. Religion, like every other high feature of human nature, has its animal counterpart. The animalized religion is superstition. It has various expressions, the abjectness of one form, the ferocity of another, the cunning of a third. It is unconscious of anything higher than animalism. Its god is a very great animal preying on other animals, which are laid on his altars, or pleased when smaller animals give up their part of the earthly feast by starving their passions and senses. Under the growth of civilization and intelligence, that pious asceticism is revealed in its true form-intensified animalism. The asceticism of one age becomes the self-indulgence of another. The two-footed animal, having discovered that his god does not eat the meat left for him, eats it himself. Learning that he gets as much from his god by a wafer and a prayer, he offers these and retains the gifts, treasures, and pleasures so commuted these. However, being withdrawn from the direction of the higher nature by the fact of being obtained through the conditions of the lower, and dependent on their persistence. In process of time, the forms and formulas of religion, detached from all reality such as no conceivable monarch could desire, not only become senseless, but depend upon their senselessness for continuance. They refuse to come at all within the domain of reason or common sense, and trust to mental torpor of the masses, force of habit in the aggregate, self-interest in the wealthy and powerful, bribes for thinkers and scholars. Animalism disguised as a religion must render the human religion, able to raise passions into divine attributes of a perfect manhood, impossible so long as it continues. That a human religion can ever come by any process of evolution from a superstition, which can only exist by ministry to the baser motives, is a delusion. The only hope of society is that its independent minds may gain culture, and so surround this unextinct monster with mirrors that it may perish through shame at its manifold deformities. These are symbolized in the many-headed phantasm, which is the subject of this work. Demon, dragon, and devil have long paralyzed the finest powers of man, peopling nature with horrors, the heart with fears, and causing the religious sentiment itself to make actual in history, the worse excesses it professed to combat in its imaginary adversaries. My largest hope is that, from the dragon-guarded well where truth is too much concealed, she may emerge far enough to bring her mirror before these phantoms of fear, and with far-darting beams send them back to their caves in chaos and ancient night. The battlements of the cloisters of Magdalen College, Oxford, are crowned with an array of figures representing virtues and vices, with carved allegories of teaching and learning. Under the governor's window are the pelican feeding its young from its breast, and the lion, denoting the tenderness and the strength of a master of youth. There follow the professions: the lawyer embracing his client, the physician with his bottle, the divine as Moses with his tables of the law. Next are the slayers of Goliath and other mythical enemies. We come to more real, albeit monstrous, enemies, to gluttony in ecclesiastical dress with tongue lolling out, and low-browed luxury without any vesture, with a wide-mouthed animal-eared face on its belly, the same tongue lolling out as in our figures of Typhon and Kali. Drunkenness has three animal heads: one of a degraded humanity, another a sheep, the third a goose. Cruelty is a werewolf. A frog-faced lamia represents its mixture with lust, and other vices are represented by other monsters, chiefly dragons with griffin forms, until the last is reached, the devil, who is just opposite the governor's symbols across the quadrangle. So was represented, some centuries ago, the conflict of Ormuzd and Ahriman for the young soldiers who enlisted at Oxford for that struggle. A certain amount of fancy has entered into the execution of the figures, but if this be carefully detached, the history which I have attempted to tell in these volumes may be generally traced in the Magdalen statues. Each represents some phase in the advance of the world, when, under new emergencies, earlier symbols were modified, recombined, and presently replaced by new shapes. It was found inadequate to keep the scholar throwing stones at the mummy of Goliath, when by his side was living gluttony in religious garb. The scriptural symbols are gradually mixed with those of Greek and German mythology, and by such contact with nature are able to generate forms, whose lolling tongues, wide mouths, and other expressions represent with some realism the physiognomies of brutality let loose through admission to human shape and power. It may be that, when they were set up, the young Oxonian passed shuddering these terrible forms, dreaded these werewolves and succubi, and dreamed of going forth to impale dragons. But now the sculptures excite only laughter or curiosity when they are not passed by without notice. Yet the old conflict between light and darkness has not ceased. The ancient forms of it pass away, they become grotesque. Such was necessarily the case where the excessive mythological and fanciful elements introduced at one period fall upon another period when they hide the meaning. Their obscurity, even for antiquarians, marks how far away from those cold battlefields the struggle they symbolized has passed. But it ceases not. Some scholars who listen to the sweet vespers of Magdalen may think the conflict over. If so, even poor Brother Moody may enter the true kingdom before them. For, when preaching in Baltimore last September, he said, "Men are possessed of devils just as much now as they ever were. The devil of rum is as great as any that ever lived. Why cannot this one and all others be cast out? Because there is sin in the Christian camp." The picture which closes this volume has been made for me by the artist Hennessy to record an incident which occurred at the door of Notre Dame in Paris last summer. I had been examining an ugly devil there treading down human forms into hell, but a dear friend looked higher and saw a bird brooding over its young on a nest supported by that same horrible head. So, above the symbols of wrath in nature, love still interweaves heavenly tints with the mystery of life. Beside the horns of pain prepares melodies. Even so, also, over the animalism which deforms man, rises the animal perfection which shames that. Here, ascending above the reign of violence by a feather's force, and securing to that little creature a tenderness that could best express the heart of a Christ, when it would gather humanity under his wings. This same little scene at the cathedral door came before me again as I saw the Oxonian youth, with their morning faces, passing so heedlessly those ancient sculptures at Magdalen. Over every happy heart, the same old love was brooding. In each nestling faculties were trying to gain their wings. To what will they aspire, those students moving so light-hearted amid the dead dragons and satans of an extinct world? Do they think there are no more dragons to be slain? Know they that saying, "He descended into hell"? And that, from Orpheus and Heracles to Mohammed and Swedenborg, this is the burthen felt by those who would be saviors of men. It is not only loving birds that build their nests and rear their young over the horns of forgotten fears, but alas, the harpies too. These, which Dante saw nestling in still plants once men who had wronged themselves rear successors above the aspirations that have ended in nothing but leaves. The sculptures of Magdalen are incomplete. There is a vacant side to the quadrangle, which, it is to be feared, awaits the truer teaching that would fill it up with the real dragons which no youth could heedlessly pass. Who can carve there the wrongs that await their powers of redress? Who can set before them, with all its baseness, the true emblem of pious fraud? When will they see in any stone mirror the real shape of a double-tongued culture-one fork intoning litanies, another whispering contempt of them? The werewolves of scholarly selfishness, the lamias of Christian casuistry, the subtle intelligence that is fed by sages and heroes, but turns them to dust, nay, to venom, because it dares not be human, still crawls these are yet to be revealed in all their horrors. Then will the old cry, sursum corda, sound over the ancient symbols whereon scholars waste their strength, by which they are conquered. And wings of courage shall bear them with their arrows of light to rescue from superstition the holy places of humanity.